Okay, good evening. Welcome to the first ever event, the Morning Exchange, here in Brussels. My name is Francesco Guerrera. I joined POLITICO at the turn of the year to head our financial services coverage and write the Morning Exchange newsletter. It's 5 days a week. It feels a lot longer than that, but it's 5 days a week for me, and it comes into your inboxes every morning. We're here, of course, to interview the Vice President of the Commission, Valdis Dombrovskis, and in a minute we'll invite him on stage. I wanted to give you a couple of sentences about what we do here, and then a couple of bureaucratic things, and then we'll get on to the proper business of the interview. So as I said, I'm here. I came from a long tradition of traditional media. I used to work for other publications, and I joined POLITICO to do this digital thing that we're doing, and so far it's going quite well. The Morning Exchange newsletter is read by about 18,000 people every morning, including, I don't know if this is a good or a bad thing, but including 400 corporate chief executives, so it's becoming an interesting forum for a lot of people to discuss a lot of the things you care about, I care about, policy, politics, regulation in the area of financial services. We are building our team. We have one other person in London. We're going to have soon 3 to 4 people in Brussels, and then someone in Frankfurt. So you'll start to see a lot more international coverage coming from our end, and hopefully the ability to link, the various financial capitals of Europe, Brussels, Frankfurt, London, and also New York. Our strength is also in the US, so we should be able to connect the dots for you and be able to explain what is going on in an inherently complex industry. So that's us. One or two things about the event itself. So you're all encouraged to ask questions. We'll have roving microphones, and we'll call upon you whenever, during the conversation or just at the end. So please, when you ask a question, identify yourself and tell us who you are and your organization, and then fire away. You can also tweet. The hashtag is hashtag Morning Exchange, all one word. Please do it. And then at the end, please fill in the evaluation forms, which are really helpful because they help our team, our events team, who's terrific, to build even better events. And of course, the event is live streamed, so welcome to all the people on the live stream as well. So as always, we're a bigger community than we think we are, and that's what these events are all about. So without further ado, I would like to invite our Vice President of the Commission, Valdis Dombrovskis. Thank you very much. Jeez. Well, thank you for being with us on such a momentous day. So I'll go straight to it. What is the value of having the Stability and Growth Pact if then it's difficult to enforce and sometimes some countries are given passes?
Well, let me start with a bit more general remark and express the thanks for being able to be in the first ever POLITICO morning exchange and of launching of this event. So yeah. I hope it becomes a good tradition and important forum for discussion. And now to come to your question on Stability and Growth Pact. Indeed, today it was important day for European Commission as we adopted our spring package, which consisted of a number of decisions concerning the European semester, country-specific recommendations on key structural reforms member states should be implemented. Also, there was a Commission follow-up on how member states are transposing the fiscal compact in their national legislation. And of course, there was a fiscal package. Well, first I would say by introducing the annual fiscal and macroeconomic governance cycle, we are making sure that at the EU level we are following member states' developments not only when fiscal developments clearly go in a wrong direction when member states are getting into excessive deficit, but also what we call preventive arm. Also, when member states have budget deficits below 3% of GDP, it still needs to be monitored that it goes in line with economic developments. And if you look at the overall fiscal performance in euro area, this year we expect average budget deficit to go down to 1.9% of GDP, and that's from the peak of 6.1% of GDP in 2010. And also we see that average public debt is now on the declining trajectory. Of course, it takes longer to deal with large stock of public debt, but we see that also this tendency is turning around. So as regards specifically what was decided today, first we were able to abrogate several countries of excessive deficit procedure, so Ireland, Cyprus and Slovenia, so which have done their job. Of course, we'll continue to monitor them in preventive arm. Unfortunately, we were not able to abrogate Spain and Portugal because both countries have missed their deadline for correction of excessive deficit, and so both were given additional year to correct the excessive deficit. Both are given a recommendation to do the structural adjustment or to improve their structural balances by 0.25% of GDP this year, and in case of Spain, which has to correct its excessive deficit next year, to do 0.5% of GDP structural improvement next year. And we will be coming back in case of Spain and Portugal to the decisions in line with Article 126 of the treaty, monitoring of excessive deficit procedure in early July. So clearly this issue is stays on our radar.
So the Commission specifically said that there were political considerations that advised the delay. What were those political considerations in the case of Spain and Portugal?
Well, indeed, that was something which was clearly communicated, that the reasoning now goes behind the framework of specifically Stability and Growth Pact, because, well, from Stability and Growth Pact point of view, it's also possible to move forward. So there are broader political considerations which go behind this Stability and Growth Pact, of course, linked with elections in Spain, and also a need to have a government with a full mandate actually to implement the decisions which would come from our decisions regarding excessive deficit procedures.
And do you think that what just happened, and in partly what happened in 2008 and other things with the Stability and Growth Pact, weaken the integrity and the effectiveness of the pact itself?
Well, of course, it's a duty of the Commission to ensure and uphold Stability and Growth Pact. And indeed, this is the intention of the Commission to do so. And as I was saying, we already see that this annual monitoring of the member states is actually giving the results. We see public deficits on clearly declining trajectories, including, by the way, in Spain and Portugal, which both had also in recent years have done major structural reforms and major effort actually to deal with imbalances in their economies and to get their economies back on track in terms of economic growth and job creation. But of course, this is something which is an ongoing process, so we will come back to the decisions on Spain and Portugal, and of course we will continue to monitor the member states' performance, also those member states which are currently in preventive arm.
What's a likely scenario for July then, when you go back to this under the article that you mentioned? What could happen in July to the two countries?
Well, in this case, if Commission's decision was to postpone this decision to July, then we'll be taking those decisions in July. So I cannot speculate on those decisions now.
Okay. And one question, I know there's some questions in the audience already on this, but are you sending the right message about the Stability and Growth Pact? There's a lot of critics who say it's pro-cyclical, essentially it kicks countries when they're down, right? By not taking action, are you implicitly saying that that's the case?
Well, as regards procyclicality, then exactly the fact that we are concentrating on structural balances of the member states is to take into account the economical cycle, because structural balance is taking into account economical cycle. And this is a lesson from the crisis when many member states before the crisis were saying basically, well, our budget deficit is below 3% of GDP, so everything is fine. But in fact, the structural balances were deteriorating because economies were growing very quickly. In several cases, economies were overheated. So instead of being at the budget deficit of below 3%, they should have been in a probably in a surplus. Mm-hmm. So now, while assessing member states' movement towards medium-term budgetary objectives, it's exactly the objective which is set in structural terms. So normally it's a structural deficit of 0.5% of GDP, but there may be different exceptions in both directions. And also when we recommend member states to take fiscal effort, we do this in a structural terms, as I was saying, also the case of Spain and Portugal today.
Mm-hmm. There's nothing in the Pact that says that if there's an election, you have to think about it, right?
Indeed, as I said, those were political considerations which were not directly linked with the Stability and Growth Pact. Of course, there is another question: is this in line with the Commission's mandate and Commission's duty to monitor excessive deficit procedures? And there is a clear opinion from European Commission's legal service that this is in line with the Commission's mandate.
I know that my colleague Silvia Shirley-Borelli, who works with me in London, has a question specifically on this. So if we have a mic, and then if anybody else has a question on this topic, which is the topic du jour, obviously, please let us know.
Hi, yes. So you were mentioning structural reforms in Spain and Portugal, and both countries have been praised for being a model of getting out of the crisis, and also a model for Greece and countries that have problems, like Greece, for example. But something must have gone wrong at some point, and if so, when?
Okay. Maybe a bit of a matter of terminology. So it's important not to confuse structural reforms with structural effort. Just to explain the difference. Of course, we know that both Spain and Portugal was experiencing substantial macroeconomic imbalances, were experiencing competitiveness problems. So number of things were done to address this, including labor market reforms, including improvement of the business environment, including dealing with a non-performing loans program in the banking sector, and so on and so forth. So there had been a very substantial structural reforms agenda in both countries, and indeed we must give credit to both countries from the effort which has been done. And indeed, it's now also seen in terms of economic growth, in terms of job creation, in terms of decreasing unemployment. Especially if we see the situation in Spain. Spain is now one of the fastest growing euro area economies. And also unemployment, even though from, I would say, extremely high starting positions, is now quite rapidly decreasing. But then this is a structural reforms part. But then there is a fiscal part. And the fiscal part is that both member states are in excessive deficit procedures. It means that they are given council recommendations on their fiscal trajectory, how they must reduce their budget deficits each year. And so on your question, what went wrong, the fact is that countries have not met their budget deficit targets. And that's why we are now having those discussions in a context of Article 126 of the treaty.
Thank you. Are there any questions on this topic before we move on to something else from the others? Okay. Well, we mentioned Greece. Big Eurogroup meeting coming up next week. Are you confident that a deal could be agreed then?
Well, as regards Greece, first it must be said very clear. From European Commission's perspective, we had never set any deadlines for the agreement because it's substance what matters. When all the commitments are delivered, then we can conclude the review. But indeed, we are making good progress. So there are three elements of discussion surrounding Greece. First, it's a package of measures which Greece needs to implement to reach its 3.5% of GDP primary surplus target by 2018. And to do so, Greece needs to deliver 3% of GDP worth of measures. And I would say for all practical purposes, we have finalized this package. It's roughly 1% of GDP is pension reform, 1% of GDP is personal income tax reform, and 1% of GDP are other measures. So this package, I would say, for all practical purposes, is finalized. And indeed, Greece is also legislating this package. Pension reforms and personal income tax reforms have been legislated already, and this week Greece is likely to legislate the remainder of the package. Of course, still, institutions will have to assess and make a compliance report, assess whether really what Greece has legislated is exactly in line with MOU commitments. But this is still a step to be taken, but so far we have not indicated any major problems. Then a second element is contingency measures. It's also linked with a question of IMF participation in the program. So IMF is having more pessimistic outlook for the Greece economy, more pessimistic macroeconomic scenario, and also more pessimistic assessment on fiscal effect of the measures Greece is taking. And as a result, there is assessment that more fiscal effort is needed to reach the same budgetary target. Yeah. And that's why there is this discussion in place on contingency measures up to 2% of GDP. This is still being discussed. So both contingency mechanisms, so how it's going to be triggered, what are the criteria, what are the measures, basically then we need to see that this is also an important element to ensure full IMF's participation in the program. But it's worth noting that we are using European Commission's forecast as a baseline scenario. So we're saying basically we are implementing the measures which are sufficient based on European Commission's forecast, and contingency measures would only enter into force would this more pessimistic IMF scenario materialize. So it's, and then there is a third element, and third element is debt measures. Something which was which is being discussed in Eurogroup since 2012, and now Eurogroup in a last meeting decided to basically look at short, medium-term and long-term measures, so what can be done, and to use Greece's gross financing needs as a benchmark, so to say, to ensure that the growth financing needs are sustainable, and if needed to reprofile the debt and also take other debt measures. Of course, this question is not strictly speaking linked with the first review, because to finalize the first review and to ensure the disbursement to Greece, we need to have staff level agreement on the measures, and as I said, practically we have this agreement. We need to have national procedures in the member states to confirm this, and we need to have a decision of ESM Board of Governors. So it's not directly linked with a debt issue per se. So we must see how exactly we will move forward. Of course, in the national procedures, from some member states, especially this question of IMF participation may come on board. And of course, as we know, IMF is also discussing debt measures and making its own debt sustainability analysis. And IMF will take a decision to participate on the program based on their debt sustainability analysis.
Is the IMF participation indispensable to the deal?
Well, as you know, ESM Treaty says that European Commission should work in liaison with ECB and, whenever possible, in close cooperation with IMF. And that's exactly our intention and our baseline scenario. But of course, we cannot take decisions for IMF. It's IMF board which takes decisions for IMF, so we cannot decide this for IMF, but certainly we're working to ensure that IMF could also be on board.
And the IMF latest proposal to the Eurogroup, the one that we now know through leaked documents, suggested debt reductions up until 2040, some of them going up until 2080, which is clearly unacceptable to the Commission. So how do you bridge that gap, given that two parties seem so far apart?
Well, first, as you know, European Commission is not commenting on leaks. Then, as regards the debt measures, of course, our debt sustainability analysis differ. So that's why we are trying to bring those positions closer together. And it's worth noting that as regards the Greek debt, the servicing of the Greek debt is probably now not the major concern or not the main drag on the Greek economy, because Greece has already very favorable conditions. It has grace periods on interest and principal till 2020 and 2022. It has low interest rates, and as a result, Greece is paying on its debt servicing as a percentages of GDP, smaller amounts like countries or Italy or Portugal are paying, and so it's not probably the most immediate concern. But of course, what is a concern is that at the end of the program, we need to ensure that Greece is able to return to the market financing. And also markets need to be confident about the Greek sustainability of the Greek debt. So there is still this issue to be addressed? Well, you use this, this is unacceptable to European Commission. There I would make one clarification. European Commission is not Greece's creditor. It's other Eurozone countries which are creditors, so it's for creditors to take those decisions, what is acceptable and what is not. Commission is of course ready to facilitate this agreement. But then it's also worth noting that conditions on which ESM and also previous instruments which were providing loans for Greece, conditions of European loans, so to say, are much more favorable than of IMF loans, to the extent that one of the options is, which is being discussed is also a possibility basically to buy back earlier IMF debt and move it to its much more favorable European conditions, which also to the extent amounts to the debt relief.
Final question on this, and if the audience has more. Once it's all said and done, what percentage would you ascribe to the likelihood of the IMF being part of this package?
Well, you know, I would not add any percentages to this. As I said, it's a decision of IMF board, but from Commission point of view, we're working and trying to ensure that IMF is also part of the package.
And so let's move to something that is, I think, very important to a lot of people in this room, the banking union. What's your assessment of this debate between risk reduction and risk sharing, which is holding up a lot of dossiers in the banking union?
I think it's a very important debate, something which has been acknowledged also by European Commission when we were coming on our proposal on European Deposit Insurance Scheme, which is a third pillar of the banking union. We also indicated our readiness to discuss and to assess further risk reduction measures. And I would say it's even more general point. If we are to deepen economic and monetary union, then risk sharing and risk reduction would need to go hand in hand.
And what risk reduction measure would you favor?
Well, this is something which is now being discussed. As you know, Dutch presidency also came with a issues note in informal ECOFIN in Amsterdam. So we had a first exchange of views on what are macroprudential measures, how we can limit sovereign debt, sovereign risk exposures to help also reach one of the goals of the banking union, which is a split the link between banks and sovereigns. But of course, when discussing these options, we also need to be mindful of the financial stability aspects, how the changes we are taking are affecting stability, financial stability in euro area member states.
And has there been any real progress made during the Dutch presidency on the European Deposit Insurance Scheme, or are we still very much stuck in that?
As you know, European Council of the last December tasked the ECOFIN to work on this dossier and would come back to this issue in June. So I'd say June Council will be a very good moment to take stock of progress made by Dutch presidency. But I would say the Dutch presidency is indeed working very hard and very dedicated, trying to reach progress in this dossier. Well, maybe it's not surprising because European Commission proposals on banking union now, including EDIS, is part of the follow-up to the 5 presidents report, and Jeroen Dijsselbloem is one of the 5 presidents.
Do you think, when do you think we'll see some movement on EDIS, though? Because it's been, as you said, it's been on the cards for a while, and it's an important pillar of the Commission plans to achieve the banking union.
As I said, we'll now be able to take stock in a June summit and hopefully also move towards some roadmap on further implementation.
Do you see room for compromise between and I simplify here, the German camp and the Italian camp?
Well, you know, I don't like over simplification, so probably I would not.
Unlike journalists.
Yeah.
Journalists love oversimplification.
Yeah, I understand. But of course, there are compromises possible, and both Dutch presidency and European Commission is working to find those compromises.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you about another topic. Unless there's any question on the audience on either Greece or the banking union, any questions that we can throw at the Vice President right now? Okay. I've got lots of questions. If these guys don't ask questions, I have lots of questions. I want to ask you about let's just call them the Panama Papers issue. So what do you think the Commission can do realistically on such an important issue for its citizens?
Well, you know, fight against tax avoidance and tax evasion has been very high on Commission's agenda also before Panama Papers, and I think this Panama Papers only reinforce the sense of urgency and a sense that we need to act. But if you look at the Commission's proposals in fighting the tax avoidance, there had been a number of things which are already done and a number of things which are still in pipeline. So first, it's worth noting one of the first initiatives we took was automatic exchange of information among EU member states tax administration on tax rulings. Also, several state aid cases we launched against member states assessing whether those tax rulings are not providing selective advantages to certain companies and thus constitute illegal state aid. And you know there had been some Commission decisions already concluding exactly that. There is a proposal which is already adopted on exchange of information on corporate taxation, basically country by country information among EU member states tax administration. Already in April we came forward with a proposal on public tax transparency, public country by country reporting as regards EU member states, reporting the overall tax paid in third countries, but once again having a country by country reporting on so-called problematic tax jurisdictions. There's a proposal which was already there on public tax transparency. We have a number of measures to follow up the OECD initiative to fight against base erosion and profit shifting, and indeed European Commission has been actually active supporter of this initiative in various international fora. Including the amendments to the anti-tax avoidance directive, foreseeing among other things also so-called general anti-tax avoidance clause, setting that if you have arrangements which do not have economic sense or economic justification, which are there only for tax optimization purposes, member states still can tax those transactions based on their economic sense. Hopefully we'll be able to reach agreement on this already in the next ECOFIN, next week.
You think that's realistic?
Well, let's see. In any case, we are working on this and I'm willing to move forward. There is a proposal we are now considering on having a EU-wide list of problematic tax jurisdictions, which is so far not the case. Basically what we have now is a compilation of national lists, and also having a common European reactions or regime working with those problematic jurisdictions. We have a number of proposals which are primarily to deal with fight against terrorism financing. But it must be said that a number of those initiatives which are there to fight against terrorism financing are also helpful to deal with tax avoidance and tax evasion.
Yeah.
So it must be said we have very extensive agenda as regards taxation, as regards fight against tax avoidance, and not only as regards income taxes, corporate income taxes or personal income taxes. We are now, as you know, launched so-called VAT action plan to fight VAT fraud, which in fiscal terms is actually generating even bigger losses to the member states' budget. So indeed, there is a lot of things to do. Commission is determined to work on this, to come forward with the proposals, and of course we hope for unanimous support in the Council, because in taxation, as you know, we need unanimous support of the member states.
And that's always not been the case. So what's...
Well, but this time we really sense that there is this momentum and there is this willingness to act. Well, Panama Papers are maybe adding to this momentum.
Do you think you have a window now? Because the Panama Papers is such a big scandal. So
I would say not only because of this, because already I would say we saw it during the financial and economical crisis, that this fight against tax avoidance became more of the priority, because when member states were in difficult fiscal positions, it becomes more difficult also to tolerate that someone is avoiding its taxation.
Yeah. I have a slightly different question, which is not strictly financial, but I recently interviewed Mario Monti, who complained essentially that the powers of the Commission had been eroded by member states, and that the Council was taking over a lot of the powers that used to belong to the Commission, partly because of the Council's strength and partly because of the Commission weakness. Do you agree with that? What's your sense on that?
I wouldn't really share this assessment. Indeed, if you look what has happened since the beginning of financial and economical crisis, that lots of areas of common EU decision-making had been reinforced. And it goes for fiscal and macroeconomic governance, where actually Commission has now much more powers and possibilities for initiatives than it was before creation of the European semester. It goes with a banking union, where financial sector supervision and resolution has been partly transferred to the EU level, and it's not sole competence of national regulators anymore. And you can have more examples like this. So indeed, we are now having more joint decision-making at the EU level, and I would say it's also increasingly triggering down in a national discussions, as especially as regards economy and finance, that indeed our economies, especially if we talk about Eurozone economies, that our economies are interlinked, and we need to take into account those spillover effects and actually work in a coordinated manner.
Would you say it's the opposite almost, that the Commission actually has strengthened its position on some of these matters vis-à-vis the Council?
Well, I would say if you look the mandate which has been given to the Commission, in a number of cases this has been reinforced.
I know we're coming out to the last part of our interview, so I just want to give the audience a chance to ask you questions before I launch into some more questions. Yes, so tell us who you are. And
I'm Dave de Ruiter from ING Belgium. If it's in scope, I would like to have some information on common reporting standard, and most particularly on the fact that before there was the European Savings Directive, and now this has kind of evolved in that common reporting standard scheme of the OECD. Could you comment on that, where we are, where we go on the practical side?
Well, I could, but maybe it's better we have really experts here also, which probably could come back to this because it's a relatively technical question, and comment to you and if some other colleagues are interested.
Yes, please.
Kurt Geiser, team of external speakers of the European Commission. Mr. Vice President, you mentioned labor market reforms in Spain. What is your feeling about the opposition in France vis-à-vis labor market reform?
We know that labor market reforms are always very sensitive. And of course, we also need to be mindful of the role and competences of social partners, employers, and trade unions, and balance all the factors and actually find this right balance between flexibility and security. So, and indeed, quite a few member states, we were mentioning Spain and Portugal, but the list goes much longer, had been implementing substantial labor market reforms. We could also mention Italy, for example, a number of other countries. And France is now also doing the same. Of course, it's not easy, but we see that government is moving forward with those unpopular but necessary reforms.
Ryan.
Ryan Heath, I'm one of Francesco's colleagues at Politico. I wanted to ask a question on structural reform, which you touched on earlier a little bit. You're someone who was very successful at front-loading your reforms in Latvia and getting tough stuff done quickly. And I want to know, did you find that a harder challenge to do it directly in Latvia, or is it a bigger challenge to convince other countries to do it from your seat here in Brussels? Because I guess it must be a little frustrating to watch you do it successfully at home and other people drag their feet when you have to go through this process now with the recommendations.
I wouldn't paint this picture so black and white, because indeed we see that quite a few countries, including former program countries, had done major reforms and are now enjoying strong economic recoveries. For example, to take Ireland, which is now fastest growing EU economy, to take Portugal, which is recovering. We're already talking about Spain, Latvia, but also other Baltic states, which are doing quite substantial reforms and adjustments during the crisis. And we see this general tendency that reforms are paying off. Of course, they are not easy to implement, but we see that those member states which had ambitious structural reform agenda are now among the member states which are fastest growing. And on the overall picture, I was mentioning also at the beginning that we see that overall member states are doing progress in implementing their reform agendas, in implementing country-specific recommendations. According to the Commission's assessment, it's still not sufficient progress, because in our formal assessment, it's overall somewhere between limited and some progress. And overall, member states are doing also progress in their fiscal adjustment, bringing down their budget deficits and debts. This progress is not even. There are countries which are doing better, countries which are doing worse, but overall we see that we are moving in the right direction, and we would basically need to accelerate, strengthen our reform effort.
Don't you ever have the temptation to tell these member states whom you're asking great sacrifices to say, I know I've been through it, stop complaining?
Well, I always emphasize that there are no copy-paste solutions, and there is no one-size-fits-all. So if Latvia's experience is of any help to the member states, I'm more than happy to share. But of course, member states need to find challenges which are and address challenges which are specific to each member state, and find policies and also the political ways to address them, which are specific to each member state. That's why when we are also discussing our recommendations, we are talking about country-specific recommendations. We acknowledge that the situation is different in different member states, and we need to give a tailored policy advice to each member state.
One question I haven't touched is how to design a system, a financial system that can withstand, if not eliminate, market volatility, something that is very much in the mind of investors recently. So what's the Commission contribution to that debate?
We know, especially in the beginning of the year, market volatility was quite a concern. It must be said that actually recently we see actually substantially less market volatility, but how to withstand by making our financial systems more robust and more resilient to that kind of shocks. And from that point of view, lots of work has been already done by, for example, recapitalizing Europe's banking sector, improving liquidity positions, liquidity ratios, by strengthening the supervision, by creation of the banking union. So lots of work has been already done, and we think it goes a long way to make sure that Europe's financial sector is resilient to that kind of volatility. But of course we know that the work is not finished. We are still in the aftermath of financial economical crisis. Non-performing loans is a major issue, and also in today's package, in our country-specific recommendation, we are addressing recommendations to the number of member states how to deal with the non-performing loans problems in their countries.
So leave us with a prediction, I guess, is the best way to go out into the Brussels night. So what's in 5 years' time, what kind of economy and what kind of makeup of the euro area will we have? Will we have the same members as we have now?
Well, in 5 years' time, difficult to predict, because, as you know, euro area enlargement is two-ways process. On one hand, it's clear that all member states which do not have opt-outs have to become euro area member states once Maastricht criteria are met. But on another hand, there are no real enforcement mechanisms on or sanctions against member states which are not really moving towards euro area. It's clear that we are not expecting any euro area enlargement in the nearest few years. I would safely say next 3 years, because for having EU enlargement, you need first countries to join exchange rate mechanism 2. It's so to say waiting area for the euro area. And
I was thinking about shrinkage. I was thinking there's still going to be any shrinkage in 5 years.
Sorry.
Not enlargement. Enlargement, we know that can happen. But we know how that can happen.
No. I'm talking about enlargement.
Yes, no, I know.
First,
but ask about shrinkage.
Already during this Commission's mandate, we had seen euro area enlargement with Lithuania joining the euro area. And there a debate ongoing in member states. For example, recently I was in the Czech Republic at the invitation of the Prime Minister, who was organizing events on pros and cons of joining the euro area for Czech Republic. We know Bulgaria and Romania are showing some interest. So I would not be excluding further enlargement. What I'm saying is that since there's no country in ERM2 now, well, except Denmark, but Denmark has opt-out, we cannot expect enlargement within next 3 years, but we cannot exclude enlargement within next 5 years.
Very artful, very artful. So, as often happens in our office, Sylvia wants to have the final word, so she'll ask the last question.
Not a final word, but just
a last question. Not in the next 3 years, but potentially in the next 5 years, how realistic would it be for Turkey joining the EU?
Well, as you know, we have intensified dialogue with Turkey recently. Well, first and foremost in the context of refugee crisis, but also in activating the accession negotiations and opening some new chapters of accession negotiations. But of course, we know that for a member state to become EU, for any country to become EU member state, it's first a process of really meeting the accession criteria, so-called Copenhagen criteria, successfully completing all the chapters of negotiation and receiving unanimous support of EU member states for EU enlargement. So it's a long and complicated process, so certainly I would not put it in a few years perspective.
Well, on that note, I have to remind you to fill the forms that we gave you, very important to us. And of course, the most important thing is I want to thank the Vice President for taking so much time and explaining so much to us. So thank you very much. Thank you for being with us. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very nice. Thank you.